Hello everyone, and welcome to our channel. History is often told as a grand saga of heroes and villains, of clashing armies and brilliant generals. We are taught that Hernán Cortés, with a few hundred Spanish conquistadors, achieved the impossible. He toppled the mighty Aztec Empire, a civilization of millions, through sheer courage, superior weaponry, and strategic genius. Or at least, a convenient half-truth. What if the deciding factor in one of the most pivotal conquests in human history wasn't a sword, a cannon, or even a man, but an invisible killer? An assassin that traveled on the breath of a single slave, a silent conqueror that waged a war of biological annihilation, leaving the supposed victors to simply walk over the corpses of the vanquished. This is the story of how a deadly virus, an ancient scourge of the old world, became the true conqueror of the new, helping a handful of desperate men seize an empire without what you would truly call a fight. It is the story of smallpox to understand the magnitude of this invisible cataclysm. We must first travel back to a world on the brink of collision, a world of gold, gods, and dark omens. It is in the heart of modern-day Mexico lies a city that defies imagination, a jewel of human ingenuity floating on a lake Tenochtitlan. It is the capital of the Aztec Empire, a metropolis larger than any city in Spain, possibly any in Europe. Its canals teem with canoes, its marketplaces overflow with goods from every corner of a vast tribute state. Towering pyramids pierce the sky, their steps stained with the blood of sacrifices meant to appease the gods and keep the sun on its celestial journey. This empire is ruled by a man named Moctezuma II. He is not a king in the European sense. He is the Huitlatoonie, the revered speaker, a semi-divine figure who is the conduit between the mortal world and the cosmos. He is powerful. For years the empire has been unsettled by a series of terrifying omens. A pillar of fire in the night sky, a temple spontaneously consumed by flames, the waters of the Great Lake boiling and surging without wind or earthquake, a wailing woman heard in the streets at midnight, crying for her lost children. Moctezuma's priests and soothsayers can offer no comfort. They see only chaos, and they speak of ancient prophecies, prophecies that foretold the return of a powerful god, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. He was a god of creation, a pale-skinned, bearded deity who had sailed east across the sea long ago, promising one day to return in a year of sea-a-cattle, or one reed. By a chilling coincidence of the Aztec calendar, the year 1519 is precisely so. When reports arrive from the coast, reports carried by breathless runners who have traveled for days, they are not merely news of foreign ships. They are the fulfillment of a dreaded prophecy. The reports describe floating mountains moving upon the water. They speak of men with skin as pale as limestone, with hair like the rays of the sun, and beards that covered their faces. Men who wielded thundersticks that spat fire and smoke, and who rode upon giant, hornless deer that obeyed their commands for Moctezuma, trapped in his palace of splendor and paranoia. The conclusion is as logical as it is terrifying. Quetzalcoatl has returned, and he has come to reclaim his kingdom. The arrival of Hernán Cortés was, in itself, an act of breathtaking audacity bordering on madness. He was not a royally sanctioned emissary of the Spanish crown. He was a minor nobleman, a charismatic, ambitious, and utterly ruthless adventurer who had defied his superior, the governor of Cuba, to launch an unauthorized expedition. His force was laughably small, around 500 soldiers, 13 horses, a few small cannons, against an empire that could field armies of hundreds of thousands of elite jaguar and eagle warriors. It was less than a rounding error. It was a suicide mission. But Cortés possessed three things in abundance: greed, conviction, and a profound understanding of human weakness. His goal was simple: to find the source of the gold that trickled out of this new land and claim it for himself and for Spain. He burned his ships upon landing, a dramatic gesture to his men that there was no retreat. It was victory or death. From his first encounters with the coastal tribes, Cortés proved to be a master of manipulation. He learned of the Aztec Empire's structure, a brutal system of tribute where conquered peoples were forced to pay in goods, food, and human lives for sacrifice. The Aztecs were not beloved rulers. They were feared tyrants. This was the crack in the empire's foundation that Cortés would exploit with surgical precision. He presented himself not as a conqueror, but as to tribes like the Totonacs, and most crucially, the Tlaxcalans, a fiercely independent people who had resisted Aztec domination for decades. Cortés and his strange army seemed like a divine instrument of vengeance. He forged alliances, promising them freedom from their Aztec overlords. His tiny force began to swell with thousands of native warriors who hated the Aztecs. As Cortés marched inland, Moctezuma's response was a fatal blend of fear, diplomacy, and indecision. He sent emissaries bearing magnificent gifts of gold and turquoise, not as a sign of strength, but as a plea. He hoped to bribe these strange gods into leaving. But for men who had sailed across an ocean chasing rumors of golden cities, these treasures were not a deterrent. The sight of such wealth only inflamed their lust for more. Cortés marched on, his alliance growing, his legend preceding him. He orchestrated a brutal massacre in the city of Cholula, a key Aztec ally, to send a clear message. Resistance would be met with annihilation. The news terrified Moctezuma. Was this the act of a benevolent god returning, or was it something else entirely? Finally, in November of 1519, Cortés and his men stood before the great causeway leading into Tenochtitlan. What they saw stunned them into silence: the gleaming white city, the floating gardens, the sheer scale and order of it all. It was like something from a dream, a city more magnificent than any they had ever known. And in a decision that would seal his fate and the fate of his empire, instead he welcomed Hernán Cortés into the heart of his capital. He greeted him as an honored guest, perhaps even as the returning Quetzalcoatl himself. Cortés and his men were housed in a palace, showered with more gifts, and given free rein of the city. For a time, an uneasy peace held. The Spanish marveled at the city's wonders, while quietly plotting how to... The Aztecs observed their strange guests, their initial awe slowly giving way to suspicion and resentment. Cortés knew his position was precarious. He was a guest in a city of hundreds of thousands, a fox in the lion's den, so he made his move. In a daring act of treachery, he took Moctezuma hostage, placing the emperor of the Aztecs under house arrest within his own palace. The plan was brilliant and seemed to be working. Tribute flowed into the Spanish coffers, but the situation was a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark came when Cortés was forced to leave Tenochtitlan to deal with a rival Spanish force sent from Cuba to arrest him. He left his hot-headed lieutenant, Pedro de Alvarado, in command. While Cortés was away, the Aztecs prepared. Alvarado, fearing an uprising, made a catastrophic error. He ordered his men to attack the unarmed nobles and priests gathered in the great temple, slaughtering thousands in a brutal massacre. The city erupted in fury. The spell was broken. These were not gods, they were bloodthirsty murderers. When Cortés returned, having defeated his Spanish rivals and incorporated their men into his own army, the Aztecs, now led by Moctezuma's fiercer brother, Quitalfehuac, laid siege to the palace where the Spanish were holed up. Cortés forced Moctezuma to appear on the palace roof to calm his people, but they were beyond listening. They pelted their captive emperor with stones and arrows. Moctezuma fell, mortally wounded either by his own people or by the Spanish. History remains unclear. He died a broken man, his world shattered. With their puppet emperor dead and the entire city baying for their blood, the Spanish situation was hopeless. Their only option was to escape. On the night of the 30th of June, 1520, they made their move. The night became known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. The Spanish tried to flee the city under the cover of darkness and a rainstorm. Aztec warriors descended upon them from all sides, attacking from canoes on the lake and from the city streets. The causeway became a scene of pure carnage. The overloaded soldiers, weighed down by their greed, slipped and fell into the water, where they were either clubbed to death or drowned. Horses screamed, men shouted and died. Cortés himself barely escaped with his life. When the sun rose, the thousands of his Tlaxcalan allies had been slain. All the cannons were lost, all the gunpowder soaked. They had been utterly and humiliatingly defeated. As Cortés and the ragged survivors wept under a tree, it seemed the mad adventure was over. The Aztec Empire had proven too strong. The returning gods had been exposed as mortal, and they had been cast out. The Aztecs celebrated their victory. They had driven the invaders from their sacred city. Their new emperor, Xitlilteotl, was a respected warrior who had shown none of Moctezuma's fatal hesitation. He immediately began to fortify the city, rally his allies, and prepare for the inevitable return of the Spanish. He knew they would be back, and this time the empire would be ready. But another ship had landed on the coast, a ship from Cuba. It carried supplies, reinforcements, and something else. It carried a passenger, an African slave named Francisco Diego Fea. He was sick. He was burning with fever, his body covered in sores. No one knew it at the time, but Francisco was a living weapon. He was the carrier of a disease that had ravaged Europe, Asia, and Africa for millennia, a disease for which the people of the Americas... He was patient zero for the smallpox apocalypse. Smallpox is a viral disease caused by the variola virus. For those of us living in a post-vaccination world, it is hard to grasp its horror. It begins with fever, aches, and vomiting. Then comes the rash, which develops into fluid-filled pustules that cover the entire body inside and out. It's agonizingly painful. It can cause... And for those with no prior exposure, no inherited immunity, it is breathtakingly lethal. Mortality rates in virgin soil epidemics, as they are called, can reach 90% or more. It spreads through the air, on breath, from person to person, with terrifying efficiency. It is the perfect biological weapon. From the coast, the virus began its silent, invisible march in. It leaped from village to village, carried by unsuspecting refugees, traders, and messengers. As it spread, it left a trail of unimaginable devastation. Whole communities were wiped out. In many places, so many people died so quickly that there was no one left to bury the dead. Homes became tombs. Fields were left unharvested. The social fabric of society disintegrated. The first reports that reached Tenochtitlan must have been confusing, terrifying, a strange new plague, a divine punishment. Priests performed frantic rituals to appease the gods, but nothing worked. The pestilence continued its relentless advance, a wave of death washing over the land, and then it reached the capital. In the crowded, bustling metropolis of Tenochtitlan, people who were healthy one day were covered in agonizing sores the next, dead within a week. The city's famous canals, once vibrant with life, became choked with corpses. The smell of death hung heavy in the air. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical one. This was a disease unlike any they had ever known. Their own gods seemed powerless against it, or perhaps were the cause of it. Was this the true... And in the midst of this unfolding apocalypse, the disease struck the very top. Xitlilteotl, the valiant warrior, emperor who had led the expulsion of the Spanish, the man who was the empire's best hope for survival, fell ill. After a reign of just 80 days, he died an agonizing death from smallpox. His death was a catastrophic blow. It decapitated the Aztec leadership at the most critical moment, throwing the empire into confusion and despair. A new young emperor was chosen, Cortés, but he inherited a city that was already dying. Meanwhile, Cortés and his battered army had retreated to the safety of their Tlaxcalan allies. They licked their wounds, regrouped, and began to plan their return. And as they did, rumors of a terrible plague sweeping through the Aztec lands, a plague that, miraculously, seemed to barely affect the Spanish themselves. Most of the Spaniards had been exposed to smallpox as children. They carried the immunity that the native population so desperately lacked. To them, it was a divine miracle. God himself was clearing the way for them, striking down their heathen enemies, their resolve hardened. Their cause, they believed, was just and divinely ordained. Cortés was a brilliant strategist. He realized he could not take Tenochtitlan by force alone. He needed to cut it off, to starve it into submission. While the plague raged within the city walls, Cortés spent months building a new army and a new weapon. His Tlaxcalan allies, seeing the Aztecs weakened by disease, flocked to his banner. His main strategic innovation was to build a fleet of 13 small brigantines, warships designed to be assembled on the shores of Lake Texcoco. These ships would allow him to control the lake, cutting off the causeways and preventing any food or fresh water from reaching the besieged city. It was a logistical marvel, a testament to his relentless determination. In late May of 1521, less than a year after, his new army, a small corps of about 900 Spaniards, augmented by perhaps 100,000 native warriors, surrounded the city. The brigantines, armed with cannons, swept across the lake, destroying the Aztec canoe fleets and giving the Spanish control of the water. The trap was sprung. What followed was one of the most brutal and horrific sieges in human history. The Aztecs they fought with the ferocity of a people defending their homes, their families, their entire world. They fought on the causeways, in the streets, from the rooftops. For weeks, the battle was a stalemate. The Spanish would advance during the day, only to be pushed back by desperate Aztec attacks at night. But the Spanish had an ally that never slept, an ally that was already inside the city walls. Smallpox continued its horrific work. The population of Tenochtitlan was not just fighting an external army, it was being consumed from within. Starvation set in, with the causeways blocked and the canoes destroyed. No food could enter the city. The people resorted to eating lizards, rats, and the bark from trees. Fresh water was cut off. They were forced to drink the brackish water of the lake. An anonymous Aztec account, preserved in the Florentine Codex, describes the horror. A great many died from this plague, and many others died of hunger. They could not walk. They could not move. They were stretched out in their beds. The pustules that covered people caused great desolation. Very many people died of them, and many just starved to death. Starvation reigned, and no one took care of others any longer. They would capture a block, tear down the buildings to fill in the canals, and create a solid causeway for their horses and cannons. The fighting was savage, with no quarter given on either side. The Aztecs would capture Spanish soldiers and sacrifice them in full view of their comrades on the top of the Great Pyramid, a psychological tactic meant to terrorize the invaders. But nothing could stop the inevitable. The defenders were starving, dying of disease, and hopelessly outnumbered. Their glorious city was being reduced to rubble around them. Finally, on the 13th of August, 1521, after a siege of 93 days, it was over. The last pocket of resistance collapsed. Cortés, trying to escape in a canoe, was captured. He was brought before Cortés. According to Spanish accounts, the young emperor touched Cortés's dagger and said, "I have done all that I was obliged to do to defend myself and my people, and I can do no more. Take that dagger and kill me." Cortés, for his own reasons, spared him, though he would later have him tortured and executed. The fall of Tenochtitlan was complete. The Spanish walked into a charnel house. The streets were littered with the dead and dying. One of the conquistadors, Bernal de Fayas del Castillo, wrote in his memoirs, "We could not walk without treading on the bodies and heads of dead Indians. I have read of the destruction of Jerusalem, but I do not think the mortality was so great there, nor was there such a loss of people." They had won, but what had they won? A ruined city filled with corpses, and who or what had been the true victor? Historians estimate that when Cortés first landed, the population of central Mexico was around 25 million people. A century later, it was perhaps 1 million, a demographic collapse of over 95%. Smallpox was the primary, though not the sole, killer. Other European diseases like measles and influenza would follow in subsequent waves, each one scything through the immunologically. The smallpox epidemic did more than just kill millions. It shattered a civilization's morale, destroyed its leadership, and created chaos that the Spanish could exploit. It validated the Spanish worldview. Their God was stronger, their presence divinely willed, for the Aztecs and other native peoples. It was an apocalypse. Their gods had failed them, their world had ended. In the 1530s, Francisco Pizarro faced the mighty Inca Empire in Peru. He, too, had a ridiculously small force of fewer than 200 men. But smallpox had arrived before him. The virus had traveled down the continent from Mexico, spreading along native trade routes. It killed the reigning Inca emperor, Huayna Capac, and his designated heir. This triggered a devastating civil war between two of his remaining sons, Atahualpa and Hufeiscar, for control of the throne. By the time Pizarro marched into the heart of the empire, he found a civilization already ravaged by disease and torn apart by internal conflict. He simply had to pick up the pieces from Mexico to Peru, from the Mississippi Valley to the coasts of New England. The story was this: European microbes were the vanguard of European conquest. They depopulated vast regions, destabilized powerful empires, and cleared the way for colonization on a scale that would have been impossible otherwise. Without the silent assistance of these diseases, the history of the Americas would have been vastly different. Would Cortés have been able to conquer a full-strength Aztec Empire? Almost certainly not. His ragged band, even with their native allies, would have eventually been overwhelmed and destroyed by the sheer numbers of the Aztec armies. The Noche Triste proved that. But he wasn't fighting the full-strength Aztec Empire. He was fighting its ghost, a civilization already hollowed out by a plague it could not comprehend. This story forces us to re-examine our understanding of conquest. It